Picture this. It's 75,000 years ago. A massive ice sheet stretches across most of Europe. The temperature has dropped so low that your breath would freeze before hitting the ground. Animals are dying, food is scarce, and somewhere in what's now northern Spain, a small group of humans huddles around a fire. But these aren't modern humans. These are Neanderthals, and they're not just surviving, they're thriving. The woman tends the fire while crushing bones with a stone. Not randomly, systematically, she's extracting fat, pure, calorie-rich fat that will keep her family alive through the brutal winter ahead. The man returns from a hunt dragging a massive deer. Together, they'll process every part of this animal. Meat, marrow, hide, nothing gets wasted. Their children play nearby, learning by watching how to make tools, how to track animals, how to read the sky for weather changes. This isn't primitive behavior. This is sophisticated survival technology passed down through thousands of generations. And it worked. For 400,000 years, it worked. Here's what nobody talks about. Neanderthals weren't the brutish cavemen you see in movies. They weren't humanity's failed experiment. They were Europe's original masters. They survived ice age after ice age. They adapted to environments that would kill modern humans in days. They developed technologies we're only just beginning to understand. So why did they disappear? That's the question that's been haunting scientists for over 150 years, because if Neanderthals were so successful, if they were so well adapted to their world, what could possibly have driven them to extinction? The answer is more complicated than anyone imagined, and more tragic. Let me tell you about the most successful human species you've never heard of, about a people who conquered ice ages, invented sophisticated tools, created art, and built complex societies across an entire continent, about how they lived, how they loved, and how they finally met their end. This is the story of how Neanderthals survived 400,000 years of ice ages. June 21st, 2023, a team of archaeologists working in a cave in France makes an announcement that rocks the scientific world. They've found something impossible. Cave art made by Neanderthals 57,000 years ago. The markings aren't random scratches. They're organized, deliberate patterns of lines carefully carved into the cave walls. Some researchers call them the earliest evidence of symbolic thought by any human species except us. But here's the kicker. This cave was sealed by an ancient flood 57,000 years ago, completely sealed. No human had been inside since, which means only one thing. Neanderthals made this art, and then the world forgot about it for almost 60,000 years. Dr. Jean-Claude Marquet, the archaeologist who led the excavation, put it simply. These lines were not made at random. The number of lines, their organization into panels, and the succession of these lines in the cave testifies to a thoughtful and organized approach. Thoughtful. Organized. These aren't words people usually associate with Neanderthals. And that's the problem. For over a century, we've had completely wrong ideas about these people. Early scientists called them Homo stupidus, stupid humans. They thought Neanderthals were barely more than animals, knuckle-dragging brutes who somehow stumbled through the ice ages until real humans showed up to replace them. We were wrong. Completely wrong. Recent discoveries are rewriting everything we thought we knew about Neanderthals, and the picture that's emerging is mind-blowing. Take Shanidar Cave in Iraq. For decades, scientists knew Neanderthals had been buried there, but in 2020 they found something incredible. A new skeleton, perfectly preserved, a female Neanderthal about 75,000 years old. They call her Shanidar Z. When they reconstructed her face, something amazing happened. She looked human, really human, not the monster movie version of Neanderthals we're used to seeing. She had intelligence in her eyes, character. You could imagine having a conversation with her. Dr. Emma Pomeroy, the scientist who found her, said something that gave me chills. It's perhaps easier to see how interbreeding occurred between our species to the extent that almost everyone alive today still has Neanderthal DNA. That's right. If you're reading this and your ancestors came from anywhere outside Africa, you're part Neanderthal. About 2% of your DNA came from them. They're not some distant extinct species. They're your family. But the discoveries in Shanidar Cave revealed something even more important. Evidence that Neanderthals cared for their dead, maybe even buried them with flowers. This challenges everything about how we understand consciousness, culture, and what it means to be human. And Shanidar is just the beginning. In Germany, at a site called Neumark Nord, archaeologists uncovered what they're calling a fat factory. 125,000 years ago, Neanderthals brought 172 large animals to this lakeside location. Deer, horses, aurochs. They didn't just butcher these animals, they processed them with surgical precision. They crushed bones to extract marrow. They rendered fat by heating bones in what were probably birch bark containers. They created a sophisticated food processing operation that could sustain large groups through harsh winters. Dr. Sabine Gaudzinski-Windhäuser, who led the excavation, was stunned. This wasn't random butchering. This was systematic. These Neanderthals were processing bones to extract fat, likely by boiling them. It's the earliest evidence of such sophisticated food processing we've ever found. Sophisticated. That word keeps coming up. In Spain, at a site called Abric Pizarro, researchers found evidence that Neanderthals weren't just surviving the ice ages, they were thriving. The site contained over 29,000 artifacts, stone tools that evolved and improved over time, animal bones showing they could hunt everything from massive mammals to small birds, evidence of a complex society that existed for thousands of years. Dr. Sophia Samper-Caro, who excavated the site, said something that stopped me cold. Rather than merely surviving, they demonstrated remarkable resilience and ingenuity. Resilience, ingenuity. These are the words we use to describe the most successful human societies in history. And that's exactly what Neanderthals were. Think about this for a second. 400,000 years. That's how long Neanderthals dominated Europe and Western Asia. To put that in perspective, modern humans have only existed for about 300,000 years. We've only been outside Africa for about 100,000 years. We've only had agriculture for 10,000 years. Neanderthals were already ancient when we first met them. They had survived ice age after ice age. They had developed technologies we couldn't even imagine. They had thriving cultures across an entire continent. But somehow, 40,000 years ago, they vanished. Not all at once, gradually, population by population. The last known Neanderthals lived in southern Spain and Gibraltar. Cave sites there show evidence of occupation until about 32,000 years ago. Then nothing. After 400,000 years of continuous success, they were gone. What happened? The traditional story goes like this. Modern humans left Africa around 70,000 years ago. They spread across the Middle East into Europe and Asia. They were smarter, more advanced, better adapted. They outcompeted Neanderthals for resources. Eventually, they replaced them entirely. It's a nice, simple story. The only problem is, it's probably wrong. New evidence suggests something much more complex happened, something that challenges our entire understanding of human evolution and what makes us special. Recent genetic studies show that Neanderthals and modern humans didn't just compete, they interbred regularly for thousands of years. The relationship between our species was far more complicated than simple replacement. Some scientists now think Neanderthals didn't go extinct at all. They were absorbed, integrated into larger human populations. Their genes live on in billions of people today. But that raises an even bigger question. If Neanderthals were so successful, if they were cognitively similar to us, if they could interbreed with us, what made the difference? Why did they disappear while we survived? The answer might be hiding in their DNA, or in the climate data from 40,000 years ago, or in the archaeological sites still waiting to be discovered. One thing's certain, the more we learn about Neanderthals, the more impressive they become, and the more mysterious their disappearance seems. They survived the Eemian interglacial period 130,000 years ago, when temperatures were warmer than today. They survived the brutal glaciation that followed. They survived massive volcanic eruptions. They survived climate swings that wiped out countless other species. They developed the Levallois technique for making stone tools. They created the first known adhesive by processing birch bark. They may have been the first humans to use fire for complex food processing. They definitely were the first to create symbolic art. Their brains were actually larger than ours. Their bodies were stronger. They were perfectly adapted to their environment. And yet they're gone, unless they're not. Recent discoveries suggest that in some ways, Neanderthals never really disappeared. Their DNA persists in modern populations. Their technologies influenced later human cultures. Their art traditions may have continued long after we thought they went extinct. But most importantly, their story challenges everything we think we know about human evolution, about what makes us special, about our place in the natural world. Because if a species as successful as Neanderthals could disappear, what does that say about our own future? The story of how Neanderthals survived 400,000 years of ice ages isn't just ancient history, it's a blueprint for understanding human resilience. It's a warning about the fragility of even the most successful civilizations. It's a mirror that shows us who we really are. And it starts with understanding just how incredible these people really were. To understand how incredible these people really were, we need to go back, way back, to a time when Europe was a very different place. 500,000 years ago, the world was in the grip of one of the most brutal ice ages in Earth's history. Massive glaciers stretched across northern Europe. The climate was unstable, swinging between freezing cold and slightly less freezing cold. Most of Africa was still relatively warm, but Europe was hell. Into this frozen wasteland came the ancestors of Neanderthals. They weren't called Neanderthals yet. Scientists call them Homo heidelbergensis. Picture early humans, but bigger, stronger, with brains that were already approaching modern human size. These were the people who would become the masters of Ice Age Europe, but first they had to survive it. The migration out of Africa wasn't a single event. It was a slow, grinding process that took thousands of years. Small groups of Heidelbergensis pushed north, following rivers, searching for food, adapting to climates their African ancestors had never imagined. Many of them died. The weak, the unlucky, the unprepared. But the survivors, they kept going, and slowly, over tens of thousands of years, they changed. Their bodies grew stockier to conserve heat. Their noses became larger to warm the frigid air before it reached their lungs. Their muscles became denser, their bones thicker, their brains grew larger, developing new areas that helped them cope with the incredible challenges of Ice Age life. By 400,000 years ago, they were no longer Heidelbergensis. They had become something new, something perfectly adapted to the brutal world they inhabited. They had become Neanderthals. The name comes from the Neander Valley in Germany, where the first recognized fossil was found in 1856. But that discovery was actually an accident. Quarry workers were blasting limestone for railroad construction when they uncovered something that would change our understanding of human history forever. A skull, unlike anything anyone had ever seen. It had massive brow ridges, a sloping forehead, thick, heavy bones. At first, scientists didn't know what to make of it. Some thought it was a deformed modern human. Others suggested it might be a bear skull. A few even claimed it was the remains of a Russian soldier who had crawled into the cave to die. But as more fossils turned up across Europe, the truth became undeniable. This wasn't modern humans, this was something else, something older, something that had lived in Europe long before modern humans arrived. They called it Homo neanderthalensis, Neanderthal man, and the more fossils they found, the more amazing the story became. Neanderthals weren't just in Germany, they were everywhere, from Spain to Siberia, from Britain to the Middle East. They had colonized an area stretching over 5,000 miles from east to west, all during the Ice Age, all while surviving conditions that would kill modern humans. Think about that for a second. While our ancestors were still evolving in Africa, Neanderthals had already conquered an entire continent. The site at Cima de los Huesos in Spain gives us a glimpse of just how long they'd been perfecting their survival skills. Deep in a cave system, archaeologists found the remains of at least 28 early Neanderthals. They died about 430,000 years ago. Some show evidence of violence, cut marks, fractured skulls, signs that they were killed and possibly eaten by other humans. But here's what's incredible. Even 430,000 years ago, these early Neanderthals were already showing signs of complex behavior. They had deposited these bodies in a specific location, deep in the cave, away from their living areas. This wasn't random, this was intentional. Dr. Juan Luis Arzuaga, who excavated the site, called it deliberate accumulation of corpses. Whether it was disposal, burial, or something else entirely, it shows that Neanderthals were thinking about death in sophisticated ways almost 500,000 years ago. But the bodies at Cima de los Huesos tell us something else, something darker. Many of these early Neanderthals died violently. The skull of one individual, nicknamed Cranium 17, shows massive trauma. Something hit this person in the head with enough force to kill them instantly. The shape of the wound suggests it was made by a hand axe. Deliberately. This wasn't an accident. This was murder, and it shows us that even 430,000 years ago, Neanderthals were capable of both complex thought and extreme violence. They could plan, they could coordinate, they could kill. These weren't the simple-minded brutes of popular imagination. These were sophisticated predators, and they were just getting started. As the Ice Ages continued, Neanderthals didn't just survive, they thrived. Their population spread across Europe and Western Asia. They developed new technologies, new hunting strategies, new ways of processing food and materials. At Schöningen in Germany, archaeologists found something that changed everything we thought we knew about early human hunting. Wooden spears, 300,000 years old, still sharp, still balanced, still deadly. These weren't simple pointed sticks. These were engineered weapons. The tips were hardened in fire. The balance was perfect for throwing. The wood was carefully selected from specific trees. Every detail was designed for one purpose, killing large animals at close range. Dr. Hartmut Thiemer, who discovered the spears, was amazed by their sophistication. The spears demonstrate that early humans were capable of abstract thinking and complex planning 300,000 years ago. Abstract thinking, complex planning 300,000 years ago, but the spears at Schöningen were just the beginning. As Neanderthals spread across Europe, they developed an entire toolkit of sophisticated technologies. The Levallois technique revolutionized stone tool making. Instead of just chipping flakes off rocks, Neanderthals learned to prepare stone cores in advance. They could shape a rock so that with a single precise blow they could produce a perfect tool, sharp, symmetrical, ready to use. This wasn't trial and error. This was engineering. Neanderthals could look at a piece of stone and visualize the tool hidden inside it. They could plan dozens of steps ahead, preparing cores that they might not use for weeks or months. Modern experiments show that learning the Levallois technique takes years of practice. It requires an understanding of stone fracture patterns that would challenge a modern engineer, yet Neanderthals mastered it 300,000 years ago and used it almost unchanged for the next 250,000 years. Why didn't they improve it? Some scientists argue it's because Neanderthals lacked creativity, but there's another explanation. The Levallois technique was so efficient, so perfectly adapted to their needs that it didn't need improvement. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. And Neanderthals had plenty of other innovations to work on, like fire. Controlling fire was one of the most important technological breakthroughs in human history. It meant warmth in winter, protection from predators, the ability to cook food and extract more nutrition from meals, light in the darkness. Early humans had been using fire for hundreds of thousands of years, but Neanderthals took it to a whole new level. They didn't just maintain fires that started naturally. They could make fire from scratch, using flint and pyrite, creating sparks, nursing tiny flames into roaring blazes. This required not just technical skill, but deep understanding of combustion, materials, and timing. Recent excavations at sites like Beech's Pit in England show that Neanderthals were using fire systematically by 400,000 years ago, not just for warmth or cooking, but for tool making. They heated flint to make it easier to work. They hardened wooden spears in flames. They used fire to extract birch tar, creating the world's first synthetic adhesive. That's right, Neanderthals invented glue 200,000 years before modern humans. The process for making birch tar is incredibly complex. You have to heat birch bark to exactly the right temperature in the absence of oxygen for precisely the right amount of time. Too hot and you get charcoal. Too cool and nothing happens. Too much oxygen and the whole thing burns up. Modern experiments show that making birch tar requires understanding of chemistry that wasn't formally discovered until the 18th century, yet Neanderthals figured it out on their own. They used it to attach stone blades to wooden handles, creating composite tools that were stronger and more efficient than anything that came before. But perhaps the most impressive Neanderthal innovation was their approach to hunting. Ice Age Europe was full of massive, dangerous animals. Woolly mammoths that stood 11 feet tall and weighed 6 tons, woolly rhinoceroses with deadly horns, cave bears larger than modern grizzlies, aurochs, the ancestors of cattle, with temperaments to match their size. Neanderthals hunted all of them, not from a distance with bows and arrows. Those hadn't been invented yet. Neanderthals hunted up close, with spears, face to face with some of the most dangerous animals that ever lived. The evidence is written in their bones. Neanderthal skeletons show an incredible number of healed injuries, broken ribs, fractured skulls, damaged vertebrae. The pattern of injuries is so distinctive that scientists have given it a name, Neanderthal syndrome. Where else do we see this pattern of injuries? Rodeo riders, professional bull riders, people whose job involves getting thrown around by large, angry animals on a regular basis. That was life for Neanderthals. Every hunt was potentially deadly. Every meal was earned at the risk of life and limb, but they kept doing it for 400,000 years. How? The answer lies in their social structure. Neanderthals didn't hunt alone. They hunted in groups. Coordinated groups that could surround prey, drive animals into traps, and take down creatures that were far larger and stronger than any individual human. At sites like Moran in France, archaeologists found the remains of 137 bison, all killed by Neanderthals, all butchered with surgical precision. This wasn't random hunting. This was organized, planned exploitation of natural resources. The site shows evidence of repeated use over thousands of years. Neanderthals returned to this location again and again, using the same techniques, the same strategies, the same killing grounds. They had turned hunting into a science. And they were teaching it to their children. Neanderthal sites across Europe show evidence of multi-generational occupation, families living in the same locations for decades, passing down knowledge, teaching skills, building traditions. At Terra Amata in France, archaeologists found evidence of seasonal camps used by the same Neanderthal groups for thousands of years. They would arrive in spring when the herds migrated through the valley. They would hunt, process meat, make tools, then they would move on following the animals, following the resources. The next year they would be back. This wasn't random wandering. This was sophisticated resource management. Neanderthals understood animal behavior. They could predict migrations. They could plan months or even years ahead. They were the original nomads, and they were incredibly good at it. By 200,000 years ago, Neanderthals had established a way of life that was perfectly adapted to Ice Age Europe. They had the tools, they had the skills, they had the social organization, they had territories that stretched from the Atlantic to Central Asia. They were the undisputed masters of their world. And then something happened, something that would test everything they had learned, everything they had built, everything they had become. The climate changed again. Around 200,000 years ago, Europe entered one of the most severe glacial periods in its history. Temperatures dropped, ice sheets expanded. The environment that Neanderthals had spent hundreds of thousands of years adapting to became even more harsh, even more unforgiving. Many species went extinct. Others migrated south, searching for warmer climates. But Neanderthals stayed. They adapted. They survived, and they were about to face their greatest challenge yet. 200,000 years ago, Europe was getting colder, much colder. Average temperatures dropped by 10 degrees Celsius. That might not sound like much, but it was the difference between survival and extinction for most species. Glaciers advanced from the north, covering Scandinavia and most of Britain under miles of ice. The forests that Neanderthals had hunted in for millennia turned into frozen tundra. Rivers froze solid for months at a time. Food became scarce. This should have been the end of the Neanderthal story. Instead, it was when they truly showed their genius. Let me take you to Neumark Nord, Germany, 125,000 years ago. It's the middle of winter, and a group of Neanderthals has just finished one of the most sophisticated food processing operations in prehistoric history. Around them lie the remains of 172 large animals. Red deer, horses, aurochs. Some of the bones are massive. Femurs the size of baseball bats, skulls that weigh 50 pounds. But every single one has been systematically broken into fragments no bigger than your thumb. This wasn't random violence. This was precision engineering. Dr. Sabine Gaudzinski-Windhäuser spent months analysing these bone fragments. What she found changed everything we thought we knew about Neanderthal intelligence. The bones were processed in a very specific way, she explained. They were cracked to extract marrow, then systematically fragmented to access the fat stored in the bone matrix itself. This required detailed knowledge of anatomy, nutrition, and food processing techniques. But here's the incredible part. Extracting fat from bones isn't simple. You can't just crack them open and scrape it out. The fat is stored in tiny pockets throughout the bone structure. To get it, you need to crush the bones into small pieces, then heat them in water until the fat melts and rises to the surface. This is exactly what Neanderthals were doing 125,000 years ago. They had built what researchers now call a fat factory, a systematic operation for processing massive amounts of animal fat, fat that could be stored for months, fat that contained enough calories to sustain entire communities through the brutal winter. Think about what this required. First, they had to understand nutrition. They knew that protein alone couldn't keep them alive. Too much protein without fat leads to rabbit starvation, a condition where your body literally can't process any more lean meat. You can eat constantly and still starve to death. Neanderthals figured this out 125,000 years before we gave it a name. Second, they had to understand food preservation. Fat doesn't spoil as quickly as meat. It can be stored for months without refrigeration. By extracting and storing fat, Neanderthals were essentially creating emergency rations for the lean months ahead. Third, they had to coordinate massive hunting operations. 172 large animals isn't something you kill by accident. This required planning, teamwork, and incredible skill. But the most impressive part, they were doing all of this without any of the tools we'd consider essential. No metal pots for boiling water, no containers for storage, no scales for measurement. Instead, they improvised. They used animal hides as boiling vessels, heating water by dropping hot stones into it. They created containers from birch bark. They measured by eye and experience. And it worked perfectly. The evidence from Neumark Nord shows that Neanderthals returned to this site repeatedly over thousands of years, generation after generation coming back to the same lakeside location, using the same techniques, processing animals with the same systematic precision. This wasn't just survival, this was mastery. But Neumark Nord was just one example of Neanderthal ingenuity. Across Europe, archaeological sites reveal a people who had turned Ice Age survival into an art form. Take their hunting strategies. Modern humans tend to think of prehistoric hunting as crude and simple. Chase animal, throw spear, hope for the best. Neanderthals were far more sophisticated. At Moron in southern France, researchers found evidence of one of the most complex hunting operations in prehistoric history. The site contains the remains of thousands of bison, all killed by Neanderthals over a period of several thousand years. But these weren't random kills. The bison were all killed in the same location, a natural cul-de-sac where the animals couldn't escape once they were driven in. The Neanderthals had identified a perfect hunting ground and exploited it for millennia. Dr. Mark White from Durham University studied the site for years. What he found amazed him. Neanderthals were very adept at spotting places within their home range where animals could be disadvantaged, he explained. They used the animals' flight behavior to manipulate them into these places, where they killed as many animals as they could get. This required intimate knowledge of animal behavior. Neanderthals understood how bison would react to pressure. They knew which routes the herds would take when fleeing. They could predict animal movements weeks or months in advance. At the Zwolen site in Poland, Neanderthals used a different strategy. They targeted horse herds during river crossings, driving the animals down a grassy floodplain into natural bottlenecks where escape was impossible. In each case, Neanderthals weren't just hunting, they were using their environment as a weapon, but perhaps the most incredible example comes from Jersey, in the Channel Islands. 180,000 years ago, Neanderthals there were doing something that shouldn't have been possible. They were hunting mammoths, not occasionally, regularly. The site at La Côte de Saint-Brelade contains the remains of at least 20 mammoths, all killed by Neanderthals using a hunting technique so audacious it takes your breath away. They were driving the mammoths off cliffs. Picture this: a group of Neanderthals spots a mammoth herd. These animals are massive, 11 feet tall, weighing 6 tons each. Their tusks are 10 feet long and razor sharp. They're surrounded by the herd, which will defend them to the death. Any sane predator would look for easier prey. Neanderthals looked for higher ground. They would position hunters on both sides of a ravine, then systematically panic the mammoths, driving them toward the cliff edge. At the crucial moment, they would charge from behind, forcing the massive animals over the drop. The mammoths that survived the fall were finished off with spears. Those that died on impact were immediately butchered, their meat preserved for months ahead. Dr. Matt Pope from University College London studied the Jersey site extensively. His conclusion was stark. This was repeated, systematic exploitation of mammoths using sophisticated understanding of topography and animal behavior. Think about the coordination this required. Dozens of hunters working together, split-second timing, complete trust in each other's abilities. One mistake and the entire hunting party could be trampled to death. Yet Neanderthals did this routinely for thousands of years, but hunting was just one part of their survival strategy. Equally important was what happened after the kill. Neanderthals wasted nothing. At sites across Europe, researchers find evidence of incredibly efficient butchering techniques. Every scrap of meat was consumed. Every bone was processed for marrow. Hides were carefully prepared for clothing and shelter. At the Abric Romani site in Spain, archaeologists found evidence of selective butchering that would impress a modern meat processing plant. Neanderthals were targeting specific cuts of meat, ignoring others, and processing carcasses with surgical precision. They knew which parts of an animal provided the most nutrition. They understood how to extract maximum value from every kill. They had turned butchering into a science, and they were teaching these skills to their children. Evidence from sites like Chasm Cave in Israel shows young Neanderthals practicing tool-making techniques, learning to shape flint, understanding fire management, mastering the complex skills needed for survival. This wasn't random. Neanderthal education was systematic and thorough. Children learned by watching, then practicing under supervision. Skills were passed down through generations with remarkable consistency. But the most impressive aspect of Neanderthal society wasn't their hunting or their tool-making, it was their care for each other. The skeleton from La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France tells an incredible story. This individual was old by Neanderthal standards, probably over 40. He suffered from severe arthritis. His teeth were nearly gone. He couldn't hunt, couldn't even chew tough meat. In most animal societies, he would have been abandoned to die. Instead, his community cared for him, fed him, protected him, kept him alive for years after he stopped being productive. The Shanidar cave skeletons tell similar stories. Shanidar I was blind in one eye and had a withered arm from a childhood injury. He lived to be over 40, ancient by Neanderthal standards. Someone fed him, cared for him, valued him despite his disabilities. Shanidar III was killed by a spear wound that penetrated his lung, but the bone shows healing around the wound. He survived for weeks or months after the injury. Someone nursed him back to health. Dr. Penny Spickins from York University has studied Neanderthal healthcare extensively. Her conclusion is remarkable. Neanderthals show evidence of compassion and care that rivals anything we see in modern hunter-gatherer societies. This challenges everything we thought we knew about prehistoric life. We imagine it as brutal, short, and selfish, every individual fighting for survival with no thought for others. Neanderthals show us something different, a society where the weak were protected, where knowledge was valued over strength, where communities took care of their own, but their most incredible achievement was their adaptation to climate change. Over 400,000 years, Neanderthals lived through dozens of ice ages, periods when temperatures dropped by 15 degrees Celsius or more, when ice sheets covered most of Europe, when the environment changed completely every few thousand years. Each time, they adapted. When forests disappeared, they learned to hunt on open tundra. When large prey became scarce, they developed techniques for catching smaller animals. When plant foods vanished, they found new sources of nutrition. Recent excavations at sites like Abric Pizarro in Spain show Neanderthals thriving during some of the harshest climate periods on record. They weren't just surviving, they were maintaining complex societies, sophisticated technologies, and rich cultural traditions. Dr. Sofia Samper-Caro, who excavated Abric Pizarro, was amazed by what she found. The site provides unique insights into Neanderthal life during one of Earth's harshest cold periods. They identified and exploited favorable environments, showing they could adapt to extreme climate change. And they did it without any of the advantages we consider essential for survival. No agriculture, no domesticated animals, no metal tools, no written language. Just intelligence, cooperation, and an incredible ability to adapt. By 60,000 years ago, Neanderthals had perfected their way of life. They had technologies that worked, social structures that supported their communities, strategies that had been tested over hundreds of thousands of years. They controlled territories stretching from Spain to Siberia. They had survived climate changes that destroyed countless other species. They had built a civilization perfectly adapted to Ice Age Europe. They seemed unstoppable. And then, somewhere in Africa, another group of humans was preparing to leave their homeland. Humans who had been evolving in isolation for hundreds of thousands of years. Humans with slightly different brains, different tools, different ways of organizing their societies. These humans had never experienced Ice Age Europe. They had never hunted mammoth or processed fat or survived temperatures that could freeze your breath. They had no idea what they were walking into. But they had something else, something that would change everything. They had each other in larger numbers than Neanderthals had ever imagined, and they were coming north. The collision between these two human species would determine the future of our planet. One group had 400,000 years of Ice Age experience. The other had innovation, numbers, and technologies that had never been tested in European winters. Only one would survive the encounter. The question that haunts scientists today is simple. Why weren't the Neanderthals the winners? The question that haunts scientists today is simple. Why weren't the Neanderthals the winners? 60,000 years ago, a small group of modern humans left Africa. They had been evolving in isolation for hundreds of thousands of years, while Neanderthals mastered Ice Age Europe. Now they were heading north into territories that had been Neanderthal homeland for longer than our entire recorded history. These early modern humans had no idea what they were walking into. Europe was Neanderthal country. Every valley, every cave, every hunting ground had been mapped and exploited by Neanderthal communities for millennia. The newcomers were entering a world where every advantage belonged to the natives. Neanderthals knew which plants were edible and which were poisonous. They knew where to find water during droughts. They knew how to track animals through forests that modern humans had never seen. They understood the rhythms of Ice Age Europe in ways that would take the newcomer centuries to learn. If this were a simple territorial conflict, Neanderthals should have won easily. But it wasn't simple. Nothing about the relationship between Neanderthals and modern humans was simple. The first clue comes from our DNA. Today, anyone whose ancestors came from outside Africa carries Neanderthal genes. About 2% of European and Asian DNA comes directly from Neanderthals. This tells us something important about those early encounters. They weren't always violent. Dr. Svante Pääbo, who won the Nobel Prize for sequencing the Neanderthal genome, put it bluntly: they met and they mated. But the genetic evidence reveals something disturbing. While modern humans carry Neanderthal DNA, late Neanderthal fossils show almost no modern human genetic influence. Gene flow was happening in only one direction. Modern humans were absorbing Neanderthal genes. Neanderthals weren't absorbing modern human genes. Dr. Chris Stringer from the Natural History Museum in London thinks he knows why. It's possible that only certain combinations of interbreeding were successful. Maybe only male Neanderthals and female modern humans could produce viable offspring. If that's true, it means something chilling. Every time a Neanderthal woman left her community to join modern humans, the Neanderthal population got smaller. Every successful interbreeding event was also a step toward extinction. The newcomers weren't just competing with Neanderthals, they were absorbing them. But genetics tells only part of the story. Climate change was about to make everything worse. 45,000 years ago, just as modern humans were establishing themselves in Europe, the climate took a turn for the catastrophic. Geologists call it Heinrich Event 4. Massive ice sheets collapsed into the North Atlantic, disrupting ocean currents and plunging Europe into one of the coldest periods in 100,000 years. Temperatures dropped by 10 degrees Celsius in just a few decades. Forests died, grasslands turned to tundra. The large herbivores that Neanderthals had been hunting for millennia either migrated south or went extinct. This should have been Neanderthal territory. They were the Ice Age specialists. They had survived dozens of similar climate disasters over the past 400,000 years. But this time was different. This time, they weren't alone. The new arrivals had something Neanderthals had never encountered before: backup. When Neanderthal populations crashed during previous climate events, they had slowly rebuilt in isolation. But now, every empty territory was being filled by waves of modern humans migrating from the south. There was nowhere to retreat, nowhere to recover. Dr. John Shea from Stony Brook University studies extinction patterns in prehistoric populations. His analysis is stark. Eventually, it gets too cold to find food, and they froze to death. But this time, when Neanderthal populations declined, humans moved in and took over the territory. And then things got even worse. 39,000 years ago, Mount Vesuvius wasn't the only volcano threatening ancient Europe. Near Naples, Italy, another volcano called Campi Flegrei erupted with the force of 1,000 Mount St. Helens explosions. The Campanian ignimbrite eruption was one of the largest volcanic explosions in European history. It ejected 150 cubic miles of ash and rock into the atmosphere. The ash cloud covered most of Eastern Europe in several inches of volcanic debris. Dr. Golovanova, who studied the geological evidence, believes this eruption delivered the final blow to many Neanderthal populations. The environmental damage was severe. Plant life was devastated across huge areas. The animals Neanderthals depended on either died or migrated away from the affected regions. Archaeological sites across Europe tell the same story. Neanderthal occupation layers from this period show sudden abandonment, tools left behind, fires that were never relit, evidence of communities that simply vanished. But the volcanic winter wasn't the only disaster striking Neanderthal populations. Recent research suggests they were facing an invisible enemy even deadlier than climate change: disease. Dr. Gilly Greenbaum from Stanford University has developed computer models of what might have happened when modern humans first encountered Neanderthals. His findings are disturbing. Our research suggests that diseases may have played a more important role in the extinction of the Neanderthals than previously thought. They may even be the main reason why modern humans are now the only human group left on the planet. The theory works like this. Modern humans had evolved in tropical Africa, where disease pressure is intense. They had been exposed to pathogens from numerous animal species, including early domesticated animals. Their immune systems were battle-tested. Neanderthals had evolved in the relatively sterile environment of Ice Age Europe. They had excellent immunity to local diseases, but no resistance to tropical pathogens. When the two populations met, modern humans might have been walking biological weapons. Greenbaum's models show that even small differences in disease resistance could have given modern humans a decisive advantage. It could be that by the time modern humans were almost entirely released from the added burden of Neanderthal diseases, Neanderthals were still very much vulnerable to modern human diseases. This wasn't intentional biological warfare. Neither species understood disease transmission, but the result would have been the same. Neanderthal populations crashing whenever they came into contact with the newcomers. The archaeological evidence supports this theory. Neanderthal sites don't show evidence of massive battles or violent conquest. Instead, they show gradual abandonment. Communities that slowly dwindled and disappeared. It was a silent extinction. But Neanderthals didn't go quietly. As their world collapsed around them, they made one last stand. 40,000 years ago, the final Neanderthal populations retreated to their ultimate refuge, the Iberian Peninsula. Southern Spain and Portugal became the last Neanderthal stronghold, protecting communities that had survived everything Ice Age Europe could throw at them. Gibraltar's caves tell the story of these final populations. Gorham's cave, perched on the Mediterranean coast, contains evidence of Neanderthal occupation until at least 32,000 years ago. Maybe longer. These weren't desperate survivors clinging to existence. The Gibraltar Neanderthals were thriving. They hunted dolphins and seals. They collected shellfish and birds. They created sophisticated tools and maintained complex social structures. Dr. Clive Finlayson, who excavated Gorham's cave, was amazed by what he found. The Neanderthals here weren't in decline. They had adapted to a coastal environment and were successfully exploiting marine resources. They had even begun making art, geometric patterns carved into the cave walls. Symbols that might have had meaning we'll never understand. But their isolation was also their doom. Cut off from other Neanderthal populations, the Gibraltar communities were genetically trapped. With no new blood coming in, they began suffering from inbreeding depression. Populations that had once numbered in the thousands dwindled to hundreds, then dozens. Genetic analysis of late Neanderthal fossils shows the telltale signs of inbreeding, high infant mortality, reduced fertility, accumulating genetic defects that weakened each new generation. The same thing that had made them masters of Ice Age Europe, their small, tight-knit communities, became their ultimate weakness. Meanwhile, modern human populations were exploding. Archaeological evidence suggests early modern human groups were 10 times larger than comparable Neanderthal communities. They had social networks that stretched across continents. When one group failed, others could move in to replace them. Neanderthals had perfected survival in small groups. Modern humans had perfected survival in large ones. The final Neanderthal sites in Spain show increasingly desperate adaptation. Tools became cruder, settlement patterns more scattered. Evidence of the sophisticated cultural traditions that had sustained them for millennia began to disappear. At Zafaria Cave in southern Spain, the last traces of Neanderthal occupation date to around 32,000 years ago. After that, nothing. No more tools, no more bones, no more evidence of the people who had ruled Europe for 400,000 years. They were gone, but the mystery remains. Why them? Why not us? Neanderthals had every advantage. They were stronger, better adapted to the climate, more experienced with Ice Age conditions. Their brains were actually larger than ours. They had technologies that had been perfected over hundreds of thousands of years. Modern humans were the newcomers, the underdogs, the species that should have been outcompeted and absorbed. Yet here we are, and they're extinct. Dr. Rick Potts from the Smithsonian Institution has spent decades studying human evolution. His theory about Neanderthal extinction is haunting. Neanderthals were really good at surviving in their local environments, but if things weren't good where they were at any given time, they didn't seem to have the kind of long-distance social alliances that allowed Homo sapiens to overcome all obstacles. Adaptability versus specialization, networks versus isolation, innovation versus perfection. Neanderthals had spent 400,000 years becoming the perfect Ice Age humans, but perfection, it turns out, can be a trap. When the rules of survival changed, when climate catastrophes struck, when diseases arrived, when competitors appeared, Neanderthals couldn't change fast enough. They were like master craftsmen who had spent their entire lives perfecting a single skill, only to discover that the world no longer needed what they had to offer. But their story doesn't end with extinction. In a way, it's just beginning, because Neanderthals didn't completely disappear. They live on in our genes, in our immune systems, in the shape of our skulls and the colour of our hair. They also live on in the lessons they teach us about survival, adaptation, and the fragility of even the most successful civilizations. The question isn't just why Neanderthals went extinct, it's what their extinction tells us about our own future. The question isn't just why Neanderthals went extinct, it's what their extinction tells us about our own future. Because here's the thing that keeps me awake at night. Neanderthals weren't some primitive species that stumbled through the Ice Ages by accident. They were us. They were intelligent, adaptable, innovative humans who built a civilization that lasted nearly 500,000 years. And they vanished in less than 10,000 years. Think about that timeline for a second. 400,000 years of continuous success, surviving climate disasters that wiped out countless other species, adapting to environmental changes that would challenge our modern technology, building technologies and social structures that sustained them through dozens of ice ages. Then, in the geological blink of an eye, they were gone. What happened to them could happen to us. But their story doesn't end with extinction, because Neanderthals never really disappeared. Right now, as you're reading this, Neanderthal DNA is coursing through your veins. If your ancestors came from anywhere outside Africa, about 2% of your genome comes directly from Neanderthals. You're part Neanderthal. That's not just some interesting footnote in your family tree. Those Neanderthal genes are actively shaping who you are. Your immune system, your hair colour, your skin tone, your ability to process certain foods, even your risk for some diseases. Dr. Svante Pääbo, who sequenced the first Neanderthal genome, puts it perfectly. In some sense, they are not extinct. They live on in some of us. With 8 billion people on Earth today, there's more Neanderthal DNA on the planet now than when they were actually alive. Recent studies are revealing just how much we owe to our Neanderthal inheritance. Some Neanderthal genes help modern humans fight off viruses. Others help us adapt to high altitudes. Still others influence how our brains develop. The woman from Shanidar Cave that we met at the beginning of this story, her genes might be helping you fight off a cold right now. But Neanderthals left us something more valuable than DNA. They left us lessons about survival that we're only just beginning to understand. The first lesson is about the danger of perfection. Neanderthals spent 400,000 years perfecting their way of life. Their tools were incredibly efficient. Their hunting strategies were flawless. Their social structures were perfectly adapted to Ice Age conditions. They had achieved something remarkable, a sustainable civilization that could last for hundreds of millennia. But perfection made them vulnerable. When conditions changed rapidly, when new diseases arrived, when the climate shifted, when competitors appeared, Neanderthals couldn't adapt fast enough. They had become so specialized, so perfectly adapted to their specific environment that they couldn't handle disruption. Modern humans took a different approach. We were generalists, adaptable, always changing, always innovating, always ready to try something new. We were messier, less efficient, more chaotic, but we survived. Dr. Rick Potts calls this the variability selection hypothesis, the idea that success comes not from perfecting one strategy, but from maintaining the ability to change strategies when needed. The key to human survival, Potts explains, isn't being perfectly adapted to any one environment. It's being able to adapt to any environment. This lesson is more relevant today than ever. We live in a world of rapid change, climate change, technological disruption, global pandemics, economic upheaval. The challenges we face today would have been unimaginable to our ancestors just a few generations ago. Are we adapting, or are we becoming like the Neanderthals, so specialized, so committed to our current way of life that we can't change when we need to? The second lesson is about the power and danger of isolation. Neanderthals lived in small, tight-knit communities. These groups were incredibly effective at surviving local challenges. They shared knowledge, supported each other, and maintained cultural traditions for thousands of years. But when disasters struck, their isolation became a weakness. Cut off from other populations, they couldn't get help. They couldn't share innovations. They couldn't maintain genetic diversity. Modern humans survived because we maintained connections across vast distances. When one group failed, others could help. When someone developed a new technology, it spread rapidly across continents. Today, we face the same choice. Do we retreat into isolated communities, perfect and pure but vulnerable? Or do we maintain connections, messy and complex but resilient? The COVID-19 pandemic gave us a preview of what isolation costs. Countries that closed their borders completely suffered economically. Communities that refused outside help had higher death rates. Isolation felt safe, but it made us weaker. Neanderthals teach us that connection, however uncomfortable, is essential for survival. The third lesson is about the importance of diversity. Late Neanderthal populations showed clear signs of inbreeding. Genetic diversity declined. Populations became more similar to each other. This might have made them more cohesive, but it also made them more vulnerable. When everyone thinks the same way, uses the same tools, follows the same strategies, disaster can wipe out entire populations at once. Modern human populations that survived and thrived were those that maintained diversity. Different groups developed different technologies, different solutions to the same problems. When one approach failed, others were available. This applies to more than just genetics. Cultural diversity, technological diversity, even economic diversity make societies more resilient. Neanderthals had perfected one way of life. We developed many. But perhaps the most important lesson from Neanderthals is about time. 400,000 years. That's how long Neanderthal civilization lasted. To put that in perspective, our entire recorded history covers only about 5,000 years. We've had agriculture for 10,000 years. We've had industrial civilization for only 250 years. Neanderthals built something that lasted 40 times longer than everything we consider ancient, yet they still went extinct. This should be humbling. It should make us think carefully about the choices we're making today, about the assumptions we're building our civilization on, about the risks we're ignoring because they seem distant or unlikely. Climate change is happening faster today than during any Neanderthal extinction event. We're facing environmental disruption that would challenge even Ice Age specialists. Are we prepared? We're also more connected than any human population in history, but we're also more specialized, more dependent on complex systems, more vulnerable to cascading failures. Neanderthals survived 400,000 years without agriculture, without writing, without global trade networks. They were resilient because they were simple. We're powerful because we're complex, but complexity can be fragile. The final lesson from Neanderthals is about legacy. They've been extinct for 32,000 years, but their story continues to shape our understanding of what it means to be human. Every new discovery changes how we see ourselves. Every fossil reveals something new about intelligence, culture, and survival. The cave art at La Roche-Cotard, the compassionate care at Shanidar, the sophisticated hunting at Moran, the fat processing at Neumark Nord. Each discovery shows us capabilities we didn't think Neanderthals possessed. And each discovery makes us question what makes us special. For 150 years, we told ourselves that Neanderthals went extinct because they were inferior, less intelligent, less creative, less human. We were wrong. Neanderthals went extinct because they were unlucky, because they lived in smaller populations, because they encountered diseases they'd never faced, because they met us at the worst possible moment in their history. They weren't inferior, they were different. And in that difference lies both warning and hope. The warning is clear. Success doesn't guarantee survival. Perfection doesn't prevent extinction. Even the most sophisticated civilizations can vanish when conditions change rapidly enough. But there's hope too. Neanderthals show us that intelligence, creativity, and compassion aren't uniquely modern human traits. They're part of a deeper human heritage that connects us to our ancient past. The same qualities that helped Neanderthals survive 400,000 years of ice ages still exist in us today. We have their DNA. We have their legacy. We have their lessons. The question is whether we'll learn from them. Climate change is accelerating. Technology is disrupting every aspect of human life. Populations are becoming more isolated and polarized. The challenges we face today would test even the most adaptable species, but we have advantages Neanderthals never had. We have global communication. We have scientific understanding of climate and disease. We have technologies that can help us adapt to changing conditions. Most importantly, we have their story as a guide. Neanderthals teach us that survival isn't about being perfect, it's about being adaptable. It's not about isolation, it's about connection. It's not about avoiding change, it's about embracing it. They survived 400,000 years by being incredibly good at one thing. We've survived 300,000 years by being pretty good at many things. The future belongs to those who can learn, adapt, and change. As I finish writing this, I think about that woman from Shanidar Cave, Shanidar Zay, 75,000 years old, carefully buried by people who loved her, preserved by chance in a cave in Iraq, discovered by archaeologists who brought her story back to light. She lived in a world of unimaginable hardship, ice ages, volcanic winters, constant danger, yet she survived. She thrived. She was part of a community that cared for its members and passed down knowledge across generations. Her people didn't make it, but part of her lives on in us. Every time we adapt to changing conditions, we honor her legacy. Every time we care for our vulnerable, we follow her example. Every time we choose connection over isolation, innovation over perfection, we prove that her people's extinction wasn't meaningless. Neanderthals survived 400,000 years of ice ages. They show us it's possible to build civilizations that endure, but they also show us that nothing lasts forever. The question isn't whether change will come, it's whether we'll be ready for it, whether we'll be like Neanderthals, perfectly adapted to a world that no longer exists, or whether we'll be something new entirely. The choice is ours, the clock is ticking, and somewhere in our DNA, the wisdom of 400,000 years of survival is waiting to help us